Alright, all you glorious gamers out there, welcome to the PlayersToo Podcast, the video game podcast for gamers like you, by gamers like you. You can find PlayersToo on all the social media, that's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, the lot. You can also find our written content over at PlayersToo.com, that's PlayerStoo.com. And if you could take 5 seconds to give us 5 stars over on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, it really, really helps us out. It does a huge amount for the exposure of the show. And while you're over there, if you could leave us a little review as well, again, it just helps us out even more. And thank you so much to anyone that's already done that for us. You're an absolute legend to us. Alright, and on with the show. My name is Mark Henderson. With me, as always, Mr. Lewis Camley. How's it going, Lewis?
It's going very well, Mark. Good to see you again. How you doing?
Not bad. Just another day in lockdown. They're all the same.
They're all exactly the same, Mark. At least, I was thinking earlier that at least now we're getting quite bright, sunny days here in Glasgow, but other than that, it is identical to every other day that's been for the past, 3 months.
Yes, it is. But anyway, Lewis. Well, actually, usually I would ask you what you've been playing this week, but I know that you've been playing Hitman 3. So I'm going to quickly tell you what I've been playing, which is more Persona 5, and I've also started the nearly 25-year-old Fallout 1, the original Fallout game. But I'm not going to talk about either of those this week. Might talk about Fallout 1 a little bit next week, but what I want to do is focus on Hitman 3 and your thoughts on it, because I want to know, quite frankly.
Yeah, we've not even spoken too much about it, even off air.
Talked zero about it, Liz.
Yeah.
I'm very excited about this.
Well, Mark, it's terrible. I'm only kidding.
Shut up. You can't do that. I genuinely thought it was terrible there for a second. You're the worst.
It is absolutely brilliant so far, I've got to say, Mark. I am adoring my time with it. For a lot of the reasons that I kind of thought that I would, and I imagine that you thought that I was going to really enjoy it. So far, I've played, I would say probably about 6 or 8 hours, maybe more than that, maybe 10 hours. I'll go for 10 hours. I'll say 10 hours just now because I've basically sunk a bunch of hours into each of the first 3 levels now. Anyone who's been playing the game at all will know that I think there are 6 levels in total within Hitman 3 itself. Now, the game obviously contains all of the previous games if you own them. It's actually quite interestingly set up in terms of UI and stuff like that, where everything is very much in front of you there. It is like one game that has run from 2016 to 2021. Everything just comes at you at the front end and you can click right into the story campaign of Hitman 1. But once you're just in the levels, Mark, once you get past all of that bullshit at the start and you're into the very first level is in Dubai. It's sort of in one of these enormous skyscrapers. And if you've heard anything about the game in the lead up to its release, you've probably heard a little bit about this Dubai level and another one in Dartmoor in England, which those 2 levels to open the game are superb. And they are absolutely phenomenal illustrations of what Hitman can be. They basically operate in quite different ways from one another. The Dubai level is this huge, multi-story, obviously, level with lots of different NPCs and different kind of groups of people moving around. So there's like party guests and staff and then security guards. And you've got 2 targets there and they're moving in quite different ways around the level. Whereas the Dartmoor mission is much smaller. It's a much tighter map. It's set in this one country manor, basically. But the genius thing, Mark, that this game does, and it has been doing it obviously across this whole World of Assassination trilogy to greater and lesser extents, but it just immediately gives you this total freedom, this total playground to explore however you want to go about each mission in. So your basic objectives are just always kill a person or kill 2 people or whoever it might be, and you're let loose in these environments to do whatever you want in them, and that can range obviously from just pulling your gun and starting to kill everyone and you will be murdered quite quickly. It is a difficult game to survive in once your cover has been blown. Or alternatively, you can try all sorts of techniques, from the classic Hitman stuff of disguising yourself as, members of staff or whatever it might be to gain access to new areas, to lots of new gadgets and gizmos that you can employ in all sorts of different ways to draw people out of their natural patrols or to send someone in the wrong direction, whatever it might be, plus just comical weapons, all of that good stuff that Hitman's become famous for over the years. But what it really does well is give you, particularly as quite a new player to the franchise, is really interesting routes in with what they call mission stories. So this is within each level, there will be several quote-unquote missions that you can partake. The one that you will have heard about if you've followed anything about the game recently is a sort of murder mystery element to one of the Dartmoor missions, in which you absolutely take on the role of a private investigator in a kind of Agatha Christie style thing. And that is a way that you can play that whole level. But there are two other missions which are completely unconnected to that kind of mini narrative that you can also do on other runs. And then overlaying all of that are just endless challenges that just give you XP for doing things in different ways. So again, these can range from the absolute most basic version, which appears on every single level as far as I can tell, which is to kill the target with your fibre wire, up to the most insane, incredible stuff, from using environmental props to get your kills to essentially triggering, again, these like micro narratives within the levels. They're quite often there on this challenge board, giving you a hint towards how to go about it, but they give you no other detail. So it might simply be kill a person in this particular room or with this particular weapon. But in order to get them in that place or near that weapon, you've got a whole bunch of stuff to do, and that's where your like study of the level comes in. And so it just rewards you for playing it, for thinking about it, for not rushing it, and for really trying to have fun with it. And all of that just makes for a really incredible experience.
That sounds amazing, man. I like that mini narrative inside of the levels. That's really cool. I think that must give it a real sense that it's alive, that it's a real place with real people, with alternative stories that don't necessarily have anything to do with you or what your primary objective is. If there's like one guy that you have to kill or whatever on a level, there's all these microcosms within that. I've always thought that the fact that you can kill people in such a variety of different ways in the Hitman games, and I'm talking about old school Hitman games, I've not played any of the new school Hitman games, was just fantastic, and it just made the world feel so alive and dynamic. And of course, that was years and years and years ago. Now bringing that forward and keeping that mentality into this new series of games is just fantastic to see, because I'm sure you can get up to 10 times the amount of wild shit going on in your level than you could way back then when I first played Hitman.
Absolutely. I mean, it does really build as well on those original games, you know, the old games, the PS2 era games, because it still has that core DNA. It's just, I think the way that they've approached that in this trilogy, by having these very distinct open world sandbox levels that encourage you to just try out so many different things. It unites its overarching narrative with these micro narratives really well. Like, I don't really know what's going on in the broader Hitman story. There's a bunch of names of people and agencies which seem to have double-crossed one another and all that stuff, but it's just completely irrelevant to the moment-to-moment gameplay. It's a bit like Metal Gear Solid 5, Mark, where the story just began to unfurl into just incomprehension, but dropping yourself into any of those... Are you
trying to say Kojima's story was incomprehensible? How very dare you?
I'm speaking specifically about Konami's behaviour towards it, I suppose. But
I see.
That is still at work here, where it just doesn't really matter what the game is actually telling you is going on and all that, and they've got these kind of okay cinematics between levels that are supposed to give Agent 47 a little bit more flavour to him, but you just forget any of that. And the question I keep hearing a lot of people ask is, can I just jump in having not played the previous two? And the answer is yes. It just does not matter at all. That's not what this game is. It's simply about having fun in these expertly crafted levels. The third one that I've played only a little bit of so far is set in a Berlin basement nightclub. There's about half of it that I've still not even seen, even though I've completed it 3 times. There's just so much. There's so much depth and detail and intrigue within each one that it just makes you immediately go, I want to replay that. How do I get the person to do this thing now? I'm going to go and find that out. And it's so much fun.
Yeah, man, that's really cool. I think that we, on this podcast particularly, put a lot of emphasis on narrative and how that is very important. But I think that the reason why I love narrative so much is because it gets me connected to the world in a very strong way. But it's so interesting to see that Hitman is doing that almost entirely through its mechanics, basically. The game is so mechanically sound that the story doesn't matter. And I mean, there's loads of games like that, but it's nice to see that you are still so unbelievably connected to that world and what is going on in these levels within the game and even the microcosms within those levels. Yeah. It's just incredibly interesting. And I know that that's how the whole game works. You know what I mean? It's systems on systems on systems. I just think that's really cool, and I love IO. Like, I've not played any other games, but I think they're really great. I really do. I I'm a huge fan of the way that they go about their game design, how they go about treating their fans, how they try and maximise the amount of value their consumers get from their games, you know. Yeah, I think that the latest Hitman trilogy is a real triumph in video games, and I'm really, really glad that you're liking the third one and that the third one has been received so well generally, you know.
Yeah, it's phenomenal that they've had this kind of response to it. You can see that they are, relatively speaking, a smallish studio. I've had 2 fairly bad crashes, and there's some other just wee bugs and things like every character in the game seems to be from London, even though they're supposed to be in Berlin or elsewhere. You know, there's corners that have been cut, but again, none of it matters. It's the moment-to-moment gameplay is what matters here, and that is absolutely tight as it could be.
Nice one, man. That is very, very awesome to hear, genuinely. All right, Lewis. And on that note, it's time for the news. All right, news item number 1. There has been a big mess around Xbox Live Gold this week, Lewis. Oh, dear lordy, has there?
There has.
Xbox announced plans this week that they were going to increase the price of a gold subscription, which is required to play games online. The increase was quite significant, we will say. The cheapest option would have been $60 for 6 months, which meant that it would have cost $120 a year for a gold subscription, which works out to be £86 here in the UK. Which, in the face of a PlayStation Plus subscription, which costs £50 a year and quite frankly is a better service, I would argue, considering the quality of free games that you get from PlayStation versus the quality of free games that you get for Xbox on that subscription, is incredibly steep. And not only that, from this time last year, the Xbox subscription has actually doubled. I don't know if anyone remembers that at the end of last year, Xbox had done away with their yearly subscription, and along with that came a little bit of a price hike, but it used to be $60 for a whole year of gold subscription, which was totally in line with PlayStation at the time, but now they've went way, way, way beyond that now, way beyond that. Xbox have made this statement regarding the price increase.
Periodically, we assess the value and pricing of our services to reflect changes in regional marketplaces. And to continue to invest in the Xbox community, we'll be making price adjustments for Xbox Live Gold in select markets. In many markets, the price of Xbox Live Gold has not changed for years, and in some markets, it hasn't changed for over 10 years.
This was, as you might imagine, met with quite a lot of backlash, Liz. Quite a lot of backlash from both gamers and the games media at large. So much backlash, in fact, that they decided to do a U-turn faster than a Tory MP, and everything has changed back. Everything is reverted back to what it was, as if nothing had ever happened. So Xbox have then made this statement regarding the U-turn. This is unbelievable.
We messed up today, and you were right to let us know.
Sorry, the way that starts is so good. Continue.
Connecting and playing with friends is a vital part of gaming, and we failed to meet the expectations of players who count on it every day. As a result, we've decided not to change Xbox Live Gold pricing. We're turning this moment into an opportunity to bring Xbox Live more in line with how we see the player at the centre of their experience. For free-to-play games, you will no longer need an Xbox Live Gold membership to play those games on Xbox. We're working hard to deliver this change as soon as possible in the coming months. If you're an Xbox Live Gold member already, you stay at your current price for renewal. New and existing members can continue to enjoy Xbox Live Gold for the same prices they pay today. In the US, $9.99 for 1 month, $24.99 for 3 months, $39.99 for 6 months, and $59.99 for 12 months.
Messed up indeed, Lewis. This is remarkable, I think. This took 1 day for them to backtrack on, by the way. 1 day. The line as well, for free-to-play games, you will no longer need an Xbox Live Gold membership. That's quite an important one as well, because that's bringing them in line with PlayStation and in line with Switch and PC, obviously, as well, and that free-to-play games are actually free-to-play. So that was a good thing that they added on as well. Also, when they were announcing the price hike, they also announced that they would be giving away some good free games this month. You'd be getting Gears 5 and the Resident Evil remake, as well as the Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb game, the latter two being very well timed for big announcements recently. So you will still getting them as well. But having dug themselves into a pretty deep hole there, I think that they have jumped out of this hole relatively well, I will say. I think that this was pretty transparently a move to try and push everyone on Xbox to Games Pass Ultimate by default, which would have only have been a few pounds more per month, and you would have got access to the whole Games Pass catalogue, xCloud, Games Pass on PC, and a gold subscription as well, for very little extra money. So basically it seemed to be a push to make gold financially unviable, basically. Because I don't think Xbox really want to have to deal with gold. I think they just want everyone on Games Pass.
Yeah, it basically must be that. It seems to me it was an attempt, a pretty grubby attempt, it should be said, to shift the customer base. Yeah, and you can see why, absolutely, because if you're Xbox, you're looking at your offerings and you know that Games Pass Ultimate is a phenomenal offer. It's great value for money, and it does the core thing that Xbox are trying to do just now, which is get people hooked into that ecosystem and accessing games that way. The more they can do that, the better Xbox does overall. That is categorically the case. And so you can see that they're trying to move people towards that, but fundamentally doing that through an enormous price hike is not a good look. I think it's a really bad strategy for the kind of shadow it casts on them generally in terms of how trustworthy and how consumer friendly that they actually are, you know?
Well, this is it. The Xbox's entire message this generation and on the run-up to this generation has always been the gamer first, you know what I mean? Consumer friendly. And this absolutely just spat in the face of all of that, do you know what I mean? As you were saying to me off the show, it doesn't really bode much confidence that the current Games Pass subscription price won't be ramped up relatively soon.
Yeah. Yeah, at whatever moment they think that they can get away with that, is that what is going to happen? That might be too much of a stretch, because at the same time, if we're saying, well, this has been done to push people to Ultimate, you know, that maybe explains why there wouldn't be a subsequent rise in the Game Pass Ultimate price. But yeah, it doesn't leave you able to really trust that they are not willing to do things like this. And the fact that people were still effectively paying to play free-to-play games this late in the game. Yeah, it's just all a bit of a muddled mess in terms of Xbox's service offerings, you know?
Yeah. Obviously, it being to PlayStation first of the gamers, we will say, I hadn't actually realised that the free-to-play games on Xbox still required a gold subscription, because that then makes them not free-to-play.
Yeah, fundamentally.
Which is totally bizarre. Absolutely bizarre. Anyway, so I'm very glad that they've implemented that. I'm very glad that they've backtracked on this ridiculous price hike. And I think that what they should be doing to get people over onto Games Pass is just make Games Pass the best value it possibly can be, which I think is what they're basically doing. But you don't... Do you know what I mean? It's like carrot and the stick. Like, you want to give them like a big juicy carrot. You don't want to be having to poke them with a stick, right?
Yeah. And their carrot is, you know, they've got
the carrot's amazing.
They've got a great offer in there, and they ought to just be more confident that people will find their way across. Or just, I mean, maybe there's all sorts of legal technicalities and stuff that would prevent this, but I don't really know why they can't just sunset Xbox Live Gold and sort of say...
I think that's coming, man. I don't think they want anything to do with Gold anymore.
Yeah, I think you just have to say to people, however long you've got left on your current subscription, you'll get that many months of Game Pass Ultimate at no extra cost. And
well, they were doing that. They were doing
that
as part of their price hike as well. If you decided to go from Gold to Ultimate because of the price hike, basically, you would have got a certain amount of months or whatever back in Ultimate subscription, effectively. So they really are doing everything that they possibly can to get you over onto Ultimate by default. And I think, to be honest with you, if you've got a Series X or a Series S, get involved with Games Pass. Like, not because of this, like, this is all bullshit, but it's a fantastic, fantastic offering, and I genuinely believe that it's excellent. But you don't want to force people into it. Like, you don't want to look as if you're forcing people into it. And they've always been about, or certainly this generation and the run-up to it, have always been about consumer focus. And a big part of consumer focus is offering consumers choice. And when you just make one of those choices completely financially unviable to a large swath of your gamers, I can only imagine, do you know what I mean? That is a bad look, and I'm very glad that they backtracked on it very quickly, you know?
Yeah, it definitely is a bad look. And just last kind of point on that, it shows you a bit that Xbox's strategy just now is quite fragile when it comes to public perception. If people react badly to essentially anything that Xbox does, are they going to react like this and backtrack? Because effectively, if you're going for this service-based model and you're not as bothered about selling consoles and discs to people as PlayStation is, you can't really afford to have big negative PR stories like this, because you need people to really invest in what you're doing, and this might put them off. So
absolutely, that's a really interesting point. Actually, I think there's probably quite a lot in that, but they seem to have went into this price hike with absolutely zero conviction because it took one day of backlash for them to turn around. All right, Loose News item number 2. Gabe Newell, founder and president of Valve, has given a few interviews to New Zealand's News 1, discussing many things, including brain-computer interfaces and moving the International. And if you don't know what the International is, it's a massive, massive Dota tournament. I think it's still the biggest esports tournament in the world in terms of a prize pool. He's talking about moving that to New Zealand because New Zealand is doing comparatively pretty well with the old coronavirus, which put a stop to the International last year, I believe. However, he was also pressed on Half-Life 3 and Portal 3, which, predictably, he said absolutely nothing about. But he did say this.
We definitely have games in development that we're going to be announcing. It's fun to ship games. Alex was great. To be back doing single-player games, that created a lot of momentum inside of the company to do more of that.
So I think from that statement, we should feel confident that Valve are going to be making new games. Plural, new games. And honestly, I thought that was clear from the purchase of Campo Santo a few years ago. Obviously, when they were purchased, they ended up working on Half-Life Alyx, although we didn't know that at the time when they were purchased. But honestly, Luce, do you think if Valve release a game, or more than one game, in the next 5 years, any of those games will be Half-Life 3 or Portal 3?
Good question, big question. Hard to say. Honestly, I can see more Half-Life coming. I don't think that you do Alyx if you've not got at least a thought about where else that series can go or where you might want to take it. Obviously, a big part of Half-Life Alyx was about selling VR units.
That was absolutely a big part of it.
Yeah,
massive part of it, you might say.
No doubt about that.
And that's not to take away from Half-Life Alyx.
Not
Half-Life
all,
Alyx is probably the best VR game ever, and it has made me seriously consider buying a VR headset, so it fucking worked.
Yeah, well, exactly that. So I just think if you put something as accomplished as that together and as polished as it was, to then see the reaction it got from players, which was vastly
overwhelmingly
a positive reaction, yeah. And as you say, a lot of people kind of looking at VR in a slightly different light afterwards. It also seemed like, and I haven't really delved into this because I haven't played the originals and I don't really want it spoiled, but I think that there's something towards the end of Alyx that maybe sets up something else, whether that is just something that already happened.
I believe that is true. I mean, obviously, Half-Life 2 famously ends on a cliffhanger, and I think that Alyx ends on not quite a cliffhanger, but on something that could lend itself to a sequel or more in the franchise.
Yeah,
yes.
And so all of that points to the fact that they could do something there. Whether in the next 5 years, don't know. Whether Half-Life 3, I don't know. Well, it could be Alyx 2, it could just be something else in that universe. But I think that they will stick with it. Portal, my heart sings for more Portal, but I just don't have a lot of hope about it, if I'm honest.
I think that's a pretty fair take overall. I honestly think that the time for Half-Life 3, in terms of what the fans probably want from Half-Life 3, has probably passed. I'm not really sure if they conclude that story or not, but I would be very, very surprised at this point if a true Half-Life 3 ever appeared, honestly. I also don't think really that they're going to be doing a Portal 3 either, unfortunately. And I'm not even sure that they would be interested in doing a straight up AAA narrative focused game like that either, really, because they have been very, very online focused with Dota. I know that they had their trading card thing, which was a bit of a flop, but they've been very, very online focused for a long period of time now, basically until Alyx. They have apparently got a game in development that goes by the code name Citadel that uses either the same engine, the same architecture or something like that as Dota 2, which to me suggests that whatever transpires with that game is more likely to be an online game than it is to be something like a Half-Life 3, I would love for them to make a Half-Life 3 because it would give me the kick up the arse to play the other Half-Life games, basically. But I really can't see it happening. But nonetheless, I think it is exciting to know that a company with the pedigree that Valve has is continuing to make more games, and for their president and founder to say that they have games actively in development, I think that's exciting news. Secondly, Lewis, BCIs or brain-computer interfaces. This was a weird thing for him to talk about. By his own admission, this sounds like sci-fi stuff. However, I am sort of in line with Gabe Newell in that I don't think that brain-computer interfaces are as far off as what people think that they might be. And as well, it is apparently something that Valve has been spending a lot of time looking into. I basically just wanted to bring this up very briefly, basically because it got a bit of traction on our games. But Gabe Newell said that if you're a software developer in 2022 who doesn't have one of these, referring to a brain-computer interface, in your testing lab, you're making a silly mistake. Now, I don't think that brain-computer interfaces will be prevalent in 2022, to be absolutely clear. But I think that it's interesting. And for those that don't know, like, a brain-computer interface is just a thing that you put on your head that is a computer that will directly talk to your brain. And he said that games could be made far better and the gamer could have a far better experience than through their, quotes, meat peripherals, which is just a wonderful phrase. Yeah. So, Lewis, what are your thoughts about having a computer strapped to your head and interfacing directly with your brain?
They're not great thoughts. No, I'm being slightly facetious. I'm interested. I'll admit I didn't know much about it before this story broke and we've been talking about it a wee bit. But broadly speaking, I think the idea of interacting with a computer, particularly a video game focused computer, through your brain alone is really interesting and could lead to some amazing things. But as with all tech advances, feels extremely prone to misuse and potential harm. So, the further certain tech companies can be kept from our brains, the better, I think. Not necessarily Valve, though. So,
well, I must admit, this is the first time that I've seen brain-computer interfaces referenced directly to video games. But I actually think that brain-computer interfaces is like an absolutely fascinating topic. And if you are interested in it, there are many, many applications outside of video games, and probably many, many more important applications outside of video games, to be completely honest. But I just thought it was fascinating that he brought it up, and he is someone with the money and resources available to him to really push technology like that,
Yeah,
so
well,
I just thought it was something
presumably if
interesting,
they're developing new games next year in 2022, then they'll be having them in their test labs, right?
Absolutely. The Brain Index version of their VR headset will be on the market in 2022. I am absolutely sure. Alright, Lewis, news item number 3. There was another fracas online this week, Lewis, and this one was around Konami. Specifically that they were dissolving their gaming divisions as of February the 1st. So, considering the direction that Konami are going in these days, which seems to be to have as little as physically possible to do with video games, people, myself very, very much included, thought that this was the end of Konami making video games. However, people far smarter than me have told me that this is in actual fact just business speak, meaning that they are merging effectively 3 smaller production divisions into one larger production division, and this is something that apparently Sega and Square Enix have done in years past. And in fact, Ollie Barder over at Forbes has said that this is a smart move from a games production standpoint and allows Konami to develop bigger as well as more complex games. He also points out that after shifting their focus to mobile a few years back, and I think that basically came along with all the focus on pachinko machines as well, if anyone remembers that. Senior appointments seems to suggest that the direction might have been reversed. E.g., the new management team has either been promoted from production roles, e.g. video game production roles, or has ties back to console gaming. So, after a serious amount of panic, not least of which was from myself, do you actually think that this could be a positive move from Konami and their relationship with video games and gamers?
I think it could be, yeah. I think that's the first takeaway from this whole story, is that a lot of times these big business mergers and changes, we just don't really know a great deal about it until some of the dust starts to settle. And if it is true that this is more of an internal restructure and a bit of a kind of streamlining and a smartening up, if it's the kind of move that other studios have taken over the years, then possibly, yeah. And if it's pivoting them and bringing or elevating the experience of people involved in console gaming particularly, then you would have to think it suggests something. The slight kind of doubt in my voice is about what that actually will mean. I don't necessarily think that will mean that we get a return to Konami producing, double and triple A video games regularly. I think it probably just means doubling down on some of the IP that they have, and maybe, I said jokingly to you off air, but a battle royale or some new kind of game that brings together their different portfolios. I could see that. I hope not. I hope that, we're talking about Metal Gear Solid here effectively, right? But I don't know.
I mean, the real one, the one that all the rumours have been circulating around about right now is Silent Hill, right? So do you think that we are any more or less likely to get a Silent Hill game because of this merger? To me, I would say I was quite sceptical about what that Silent Hill game was going to be. There seems to be enough smoke here that I sort of believe something is going to be happening with Silent Hill. I can easily see a remake, e.g. a retread of old material, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is less effort from Konami's point of view than making a full new AAA game. And then, honestly, I was thinking like it was going to be a mobile game. I'm just going to come straight out and say it.
I think you could be on to something there. Like, that's the two sides of this coin in this story to me. It feels like either they have seen a reason to rededicate themselves to gaming in its kind of broadest sense. We might well get a new Silent Hill game or a remake or something along those lines. I mean, you could imagine a world where the next 10 years of Konami's output is a Silent Hill remake, Metal Gear Solid 1 remake, and something else along those lines.
Totally.
But I can also imagine a world where it is a mobile game and an auto battler, and just things that are tapping into these kind of emerging popular markets within games, but that don't cost an arm and a leg to put out the new hype thing,
Absolutely. The shout from gamers has always been as well that Konami should sell their IP to someone who's actually going to do something with it. And to be 100% clear, do not disagree with that, and I'd fucking love it if they sold their IP to someone else. The chances of that happening are so incredibly slim, I would say anyway, because it's not that they're not using their IP, they're just using their IP to brand pachinko machines and to make Metal Gear movies with Oscar Isaac. They're not using them to make AAA games anymore, which is what we all want, but it's not that they're not using their IP, They would rather put together a collection of Castlevania games and port them to a new system and make some quick money that way. Do you know what I mean? What they're not going to do is make a new Castlevania game probably anytime soon. But they are interested in making a Netflix series. You know what I mean? It's
Absolutely,
things like that, That battle cry from gamers, I just can't see happening. And I'm sorry to break the news to everyone.
It's so clear that that's what gamers want, given that the whole narrative of the story is Konami is shutting down their games division. It's like a little piece of business
everyone
news,
was like,
and everyone is like,
give
it's
us the
happening
games.
at last. It's mad.
Alright, Lewis, news item number 4. Vicarious Visions, the studio that made the Crash trilogy remakes and the Tony Hawk's 1 and 2 remakes, has merged into Blizzard, Activision has announced. Going forward, Vicarious Visions' 200-strong team will now be fully dedicated to existing Blizzard games and activities, according to GamesIndustry.biz. According to another separate article by Jason Schreier, links to all our articles, of course, over on PlayersToo.com. But according to Jason Schreier, the Vicarious Visions team will take over development of a Diablo 2 remake, which has yet to be announced, after Blizzard, quotes, quietly disbanded their own Team 1, which had been responsible for Warcraft 3 Reforged, Heroes of the Storm, and StarCraft 2. And while StarCraft 2 was a big success, the other two more recent ones certainly were not. So I think that this sucks for two reasons, basically. One, because that studio had been working on, don't know how to say this nicely, but a slew of basically unimpressive games with impressive IP. Like, so they'd worked on Crash before, they had worked on Tony Hawk before, they'd worked with a whole bunch of Marvel stuff, but it was all sort of like DS games and Game Boy games. And not that those games can't be good, of course they can, but it's just that it's not big AAA production, And they just started to make a name for themselves with the remakes of Crash and the remakes of the Tony Hawk's games, both of which were received super well, particularly the Tony Hawk's game. I mean, people went absolutely nuts for that. That looked like an incredible remake. And secondly, from a Blizzard fan perspective, I think that this could easily be seen as Activision continuing to erode what you once thought about Blizzard, basically. Blizzard obviously used to do everything in-house, and they never really seemed to miss when it came to video game releases, and that isn't really true since Activision came along, unfortunately. And now Activision have just put a 200-strong team of theirs into Blizzard, and I'm not sure how that would sit with me if I were a big Blizzard fan, you know. But looking on the positive, looks like we're getting a Diablo 2 remake, and that's cool.
Yeah, that is cool. I hope that the team had some sort of say in what projects they were going to get moved on to when this happened. I agree with you, man. I think it's...
I highly doubt that.
I doubt it as well. But yeah, it sucks. It's just not great to see this kind of consolidation, this kind of companies just disappearing all of a sudden that we've seen a little bit of recently.
Just when they were starting to make a name for themselves as well, you know? Like, they were really starting to properly make the Vicarious Visions studio something to go, oh, they're a good studio, you know? And then suddenly it's just like, woof, just into the fucking machine they go.
And it's, you know, are we to read into that those games didn't sell well enough? It didn't feel like that. Certainly the buzz around Tony Hawk's was fairly massive.
Definitely not. I think both those games done really well.
And so what is your reward for having done a good job with these classic, really important IP for Activision is just to get dumped and dissolved, effectively? I don't know. That's just not great, you know? Not that we expect much better from Activision, right enough.
Well, the bar is particularly low for them, yeah. Anyway, let's finishing off as we always do with a couple of shout-outs. Shout-out number 1, there is a new Celeste game loose. However, it is not a sequel to the 2018 absolute masterpiece of a game, but is instead a sequel to Celeste Classic, or Pico 8 Celeste, which actually came out in 2016, I want to say. It was originally developed by Noel Berry and Maddie Thompson over 4 days at a game jam, unbelievably. And if you don't know what Pico 8 is, it is just a virtual console basically for making video games. It's limited in a lot of ways, and it's a 16-bit game, and it has a very limited colour palette and stuff like that. But you can play it in a browser, which means that you can play Celeste Classic and Celeste Classic 2 in your browser, which I was doing earlier on today, and it was cool. I've got to say. This game doesn't actually feature Madeline from the first 2 Celeste games, but instead features Lanny. And the game is actually called Celeste 2 Lanny's Trek. And Celeste isn't the person in the game, Celeste is the mountain that you climb in the game, for those that don't know. And I thought this was really cool. The game was apparently developed in 3 days this time, with the proper team around them now. And there was a soundtrack from Lena Raine as well, who done the soundtrack for the masterpiece Celeste, which was absolutely incredible as well. I just thought this was really cool, man. I just thought it was cool. Any interest in playing?
I mean, I hadn't realised it was quite so fleshed out, so a bit more interest. Yeah, I sort of read this as just being a kind of a dump of new levels for the one that was packaged in with the first game. So
No, it's got its own little mechanics and stuff like that as well. It has, what was it, Lenny has different mechanics to Madeline as well, so they actually move about the levels differently.
I'll have to take a look, basically. If I don't play it, I need to see what it looks like at the very least, so yeah.
Alright, shout out number 2. According to job listings, Playdead, famous for Inside and Limbo, 2 games me and Liz absolutely love, are developing a third-person science fiction adventure set in a remote corner of the universe, which sounds very intriguing. And I think this is pretty exciting because I'm hoping, basically, because they are hiring additional staff, that they are close to announcing whatever this game is. And Playdead are one of these studios that has a publishing deal with Epic Games. And I'm hoping that financial security means that we are hopefully going to be getting something quite special, and fingers crossed, quite soon.
Hopefully, yeah. I'm slightly nervous that they might be going away from the things that we love them for, but...
Well, 3D, away from the standard 2D side-scroller that Limbo and Inside were, but as well, they got that Epic money now.
Well, that's it.
So.
I mean, I'm saying that because those games were so great that I hope they don't miss the mark with something that's a bit different, but they've earned our trust, absolutely, and you can't just keep making the same thing over and over again. And if they'd made another eerie 2D side-scroller, I think people would start to think, is this all you've got? You know, so let's see what they've got. I really hope it lives up to those first 2 games because, my God, they're some of the best out there.
Yeah, as you said, they've totally earned my trust, so I trust them 100% about whatever they're doing, and whether or not it's good, we'll cross that bridge when I've played it. Alright, shout out number 3. Warner Brothers will be heavily focusing on live service games according to another job listing. Part of the job listing reads,
WIE is currently involved in a variety of new projects, ranging from casual games to core games featuring our well-known franchises on all platforms, console, digital, mobile, with a heavy focus on live service.
Now, I don't feel great about that, to be totally honest. While I knew, obviously, the upcoming Gotham Knights and Suicide Squad games would be somewhat servicey, I think hearing it in such plain terms as that really makes me wonder about how much time and effort they are focusing on the narrative, which is what I actually care about, and how much time they are focusing on making their service work, you know?
Yeah, it's not what I would hope for either. I think I was playing the same trick on myself, particularly with Gotham Knights, thinking it might not be quite so servicey. It may not be... I mean, hopefully they've learned some lessons from Square's Avengers game about how not to launch service games that are a bit light on content, not try and lean too heavily on an IP without an actual game underneath it, and just think if we let people play multiplayer online in this world, that will be enough, because it isn't. But we'll see. It's not the direction of travel I was hoping for from those games, if that is indeed the games that they're talking about there.
I suspect very strongly that it is, unfortunately, but fingers crossed, Lewis. A good Batman game again, hopefully. Fingers crossed. Alright, and final shout out number 4. IO of Hitman 3 fame that we were just talking about at the top of the show is planning to double its staff and open a second studio for their Bond game. IO currently has a staff of around 200, which is a pretty good sized studio, but 400 would make them pretty bloody big. I would say that is a lot of staff. Apparently they will also be opening another studio in Sweden. I believe IO is currently Danish, is that right?
I think so,
I believe they're in
yeah.
Copenhagen, and they'll be opening another studio in Sweden, so same part of the world. The game will have no ties, apparently, to any actor or previous Bond film. It will be a totally standalone narrative, which hopefully means that IO will be able to do something really interesting with it. And IO are also apparently hoping that this will turn into a trilogy as well, which I'm sure whoever owns the Bond IP is also very much hoping for. But honestly, Lewis, I never knew I could care so much about a Bond game, but I'm quite excited about this.
I mean, this is really interesting as well, the fact that before we've seen anything of it, that they're talking about expanding in that way.
I think that they might have to take on the game, and if they want to continue to develop other games at the same time, they're going to need to do something, you know?
Well, absolutely. And even if they aren't working on other things, from my short time with Hitman 3 so far, I can see absolutely the ways where Bond maps on. I mean, you could literally reskin it at some points and it would work as a Bond game, but probably where they are lacking at the moment is in that narrative. It is in those cutscenes and in some of the production values and stability and things like that you would really want for a Bond game, for something of that kind of important IP status. So to just boost their team to manage that, I think is very wise.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Could not agree more. Anyway, Lewis, I think it is time for a beer, and then we'll be back for Topic of the Week. And we are back for Topic of the Week. Topic of the Week this week is the Resident Evil Showcase, Lewis.
That is right, Mark. Yeah, after we got a first proper, fairly extended look at Resident Evil Village last week in Capcom's Resident Evil Showcase, I just thought we should talk a bit about what was shown there and our thoughts on the new game, as well as some other news about Resident Evil, the series more generally, and kind of wanted to pick your brains about the direction that Capcom is going in with that. So, first of all, just any headline thoughts on the RE Showcase from last week? Did you enjoy it? Did you watch it? Yeah?
I did watch it, I did indeed. Honestly, I was looking for a little bit more from it, honestly. I was hoping for a little bit more gameplay, although we did get to see gameplay, and the gameplay that we got to see was good. I was just wanting more. Yep. And they obviously announced that there would be a demo on the PlayStation 5, which is awesome. Slightly strange that only came at the PlayStation 5, but glad that we have a demo all the same. Big fans of demos here at PlayersToo. And we got to see more of the big, tall, awesome vampire lady. So yeah, what's that like, you know?
I think that is what the internet enjoyed most about it. Yeah, just as a headline, yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I basically think that the game looks really good, but I don't think it was a very brilliant show off of it, just in terms of the way that they chose to frame certain things or show it. But fair enough, Capcom doesn't do this kind of thing very often, so fair play to them. But yeah, the headline news, really, we got a release date, a confirmed release date of the 7th of May, which, Mark, is a bit later in the year than a lot of their most recent efforts have come out. We've tended to see Resident Evil games over the last few years drop in that kind of January February, March, maybe leaning into April period. But putting it out in May, to me, feels like they're showing a bit more confidence in where they're at the moment. Like, I think that they understand that Resident Evil will sell copies and can stand as a major release of the year, because this is the slot that we would normally see, you know, God of War and games of that caliber.
Yeah, sort of coming into the summer. No, definitely. Honestly, can I tell you the truth? I think that they were probably aiming for Q1 and the game's not going to be ready. And
you think that's all it is?
Like, I genuinely do believe that, but that doesn't really matter. That's neither here nor there. If they need to take an extra month to get the level of polish that we are looking for on that game, fine by me. Couldn't care less. Would happily wait a month. I thought the gameplay that we saw looked great. I'm really, really interested in playing it. Everything that I've seen from the game has been positive so far. So, yeah, thumbs up from me, definitely.
Good stuff, yeah. Well, just on that as well, like the other reason that I thought they might have pushed it a little bit later in the year was just that you want to get it away from the console launch window and the, you know, the clutch of games that come out then, that you want to let it stand and breathe on its own a little bit. But they also confirmed, of course, that Resident Evil Village is going to come day and date to previous gen consoles as well, so PS4 and Xbox One. Any surprise about that? I mean, we've talked a lot about how the previous generation can hold back current gen games. Any thoughts there?
Honestly, not really. I thought that it was coming to those consoles anyway, if I'm totally honest with you. Like, I really had not quite registered with me that hadn't been announced.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of is what it is. I think that we know at this point, maybe until the latter half of year one of the consoles, we're going to be getting a lot of cross-generational titles from both PlayStation and Xbox, and Xbox have made a big deal about doing it as well, you know. But from PlayStation as well, despite what they promised, I think that we're going to see a lot of cross-gen titles. And again, we're seeing that with our own stuff as well, you know, from Horizon and Miles Morales as well, you know. It's not really a surprise. Would it have been good if it could have fully taken advantage of next-gen hardware and not have to pander, quite frankly, to the last-gen consoles? Yeah, that would have been great, but from Cappoint's point of view, the install base of those consoles is still so high, it cannot be ignored.
Yeah, and while stocks are still really hard to get a hold of, I really think that will all have played a big part in this. And I do think that a lot of these games releasing now, the differences are going to be in graphics and in load times only, and probably not in terms of scale and power. So
absolutely,
I'm kind of raising that almost to say, like, I don't think people need to worry too much about this being a game that feels held back in any way. But in terms of that next generation uplift, we did get this PS5 exclusive demo, which I think has been put together so that they can show off what the current gen, what these new consoles can do. And the reason that we don't have a demo on all platforms is probably that is exactly what they are trying to show off, is those audio and visual enhancements that they can give, you know?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that they've picked PlayStation to do their... I say that they've picked PlayStation. PlayStation have almost certainly paid for this, let's not muck about. But it's interesting that they've went in that direction anyway, and I think that a big reason for that was the audio, the 3D audio that the PlayStation 5 has, and that was such a big part of the PlayStation 5 push. And even Mark Cerny's original GDC presentation, there was a huge emphasis put on the audio, you know. So it's interesting to see that they seem to have gone that direction with this exclusive Resident Evil demo. But Lewis, I gather that you have actually played the demo.
I have indeed, yeah. I gave it a shot just earlier today, actually. It's only about 10 to 15 minutes long. I think, as they said in the broadcast itself, there's no combat within the demo, so it basically plays as a sort of 10-minute long walking sim.
Yeah.
With kind of very small Resident Evil light puzzles within that. You know, basically there's a couple of objects you need to find and work out where you're supposed to put them. It is all very apparent what you're supposed to be doing within it. But Mark, it's good, I'll say that. Like, it is really graphically stunning. It looks, essentially, you wake up in a dungeon that was shown in the trailer, and you pick your way through a part of the castle that we know that we're going to be in, and it's, you know, very heavily suggested at the start and later confirmed that this is in fact where these vampire women live. No other real detail is given. There's a few little hints towards what the general plot or elements of the plot will be, but basically it's about picking your way through this dungeon and then up through these castle corridors, whilst being bombarded by some of the most horrendous sound design you'll ever hear, in a positive sense. You know, it's spooky, it's it feels all over you. Like, even just the noise of the characters' feet on the carpet, so not even like flagstones or anything, literally on carpet, it is really loud in a game where you're very conscious of how visible and how audible you are. That just adds to that fear of, like, I can hear something moving behind that wall, and is it about to spring out? You know, it's got all those really great horror beats to it, and it feels like it's just setting up something, a world that's violent and spooky and a bit more supernatural than we're used to Resident Evil being. Certainly, if your experience with Resident Evil thus far is the remakes of the older games and not so much Resident Evil 7 in that first-person view, you know?
Well, the first-person view as well, that's a big discussion point as well. I'm sure Resident Evil loyalists will say that that's not right and it should be third person. And I agree to that to a certain extent, because I think that you get a better picture of the world, don't you, from third person, which I think, from what you're saying, is a really interesting world that they've built. But in terms of a horror game, if that's what they're going for, if they're trying to literally scare you, then I can totally see why first person is the direction they've went in, you know?
Yeah, and having not played Resident Evil 7 properly yet, although I definitely intend on now before May.
I need to play it before May now. My only experience with Resident Evil 7 was playing it in PSVR, and that was a truly horrendous experience.
I will not be doing that, and it is not just about a lack of a VR headset. But yeah, like, that is a huge part of it. Obviously, the most recent game, chronologically speaking, I suppose, is a shift towards first person that is being continued here. It does seem like you're playing as Ethan Winters again, the same character from RE7.
Yeah, that's confirmed.
We've got a sort of mini arc within the series here that has again changed kind of what it's doing and who it's featuring and the sorts of monsters and stuff that it will feature. But yeah, some interesting little twists on the gameplay mentioned in the showcase as well. They've introduced crafting and weapon customization, which I don't think we've seen much of before.
Crafting was in the sort of older games. I'm not sure we saw much weapon customization, but yeah, it's nice to see that brought back in the Attaché case as well, obviously.
Yeah,
being brought back.
The Attaché case is really interesting to me. It's a return to a mode of inventory management, which I think is quite a key part of Resident Evil, because that...
It's a huge part of Resident Evil, man.
Because to have that survival horror element, you need to feel like you cannot just carry whatever you find. And obviously they've used weight quite a lot in the past and that kind of thing, but having that little jigsaw or Tetris board almost that you have to manage makes for a really kind of... It can be quite challenging at times. I remember in older games having to drop guns in order to make space for something else, and that's a big decision in a horror game.
Yeah. So that was introduced in 4, and I'm super glad to see that coming back, because it's just not quite the same in the older ones where it's just a grid menu, do you know what I mean? I much prefer the case, because it gives you something tactile. It's just a very elegant way of limiting your inventory in a natural way to the story, do you know what I mean?
Exactly that, yeah. And also returning from 4 in an interesting kind of new light is the merchant, who is now being represented as this character, the Duke, this big, enormous, grotesque figure who appears in the trailer at a few different points. There's quite an interesting line, I think, that carries between 4 and 8 in terms of its setting in a kind of weird, spooky European village, the return of certain mechanics and character archetypes, which, I mean, personally speaking, I really hope that there is a big influence from 4 on this game. I think it would absolutely be to its merit if they had done that.
Well, absolutely, and I think that because they are remaking 4, we know that they're remaking 4, and 4 will hopefully be the next Resident Evil game that comes out after 8. It makes a lot of sense as well. You're sort of priming your audience for that as well, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah. Reintroducing them to certain concepts, making them fall in love with what that game was about. Yeah, bringing up the Resident Evil 4 remake, though, we did get some news about that this week as well. And it seems like the game is effectively being rebooted in the middle of its production.
Yeah, it's done a real Metroid Prime 4 on us.
Let's hope we hear about it much sooner, though.
Christ, yes.
So just in case anyone has missed that story, there seems to have been a change of leadership around who would be remaking Resident Evil 4, and it seems that it has moved from this new studio called M2, which sort of spun out of Platinum Games and Tetsuya Minami. They had been put in charge of the game originally, but now Capcom Division 1, which is kind of the core Capcom team, I think, seems to have retaken control of the production of the game. And that all seems to come down oddly, and to me really fascinatingly, to a bit of disagreement about how to interpret reaction to the previous two remake games. Basically, in short, that M2 were looking to stick very faithfully to what Resident Evil 4 originally did because of the backlash that Resident Evil 3 remake saw, whereas Capcom themselves seem to want to have a remake that's inspired by the original, but that also can add, new story elements, new features, new areas, presumably just whole new sections altogether, kind of riffing on what Resident Evil 2 remake did with Mr. X, which took something that was in the original game and really expanded on it and made it the core of that game. So, I guess first of all, do you think that a Resident Evil 4 remake is actually needed now? That game, to me, it was something like 15 years ago now it came out, but it still feels quite fresh somehow.
That's terrifying. I don't think Resident Evil 4 strictly needs a remake, but, I mean, what games need a remake is incredibly subjective, let's be honest. Because I think Resident Evil 4 holds up pretty well. The last time I played it certainly wasn't 15 years ago, but the last time I played it, I felt as though it held up pretty good. However, if you're telling me that I can get a remake of that game, absolutely yes, 100 times yes, give it to me immediately. I have no problem playing this remake whatsoever. Resident Evil 4 is just such an incredibly good game. It is so fucking good. It is one of my favourite games ever. If someone wants to remake it, I'm not going to be complaining. Having said that, would I rather have a game remade beat for beat? I suppose very similar to those Crash remakes that we were talking about, right? It's just a remade version of those old games, level for level, jump for jump. Or would I rather have a game inspired by Resident Evil 4, made by that same team at Capcom though, and maybe takes it in a slightly more different, more modern direction? Honestly, I don't fucking know. I don't know what one of them I would rather. But if someone wanted to make either of them, I would be pretty fucking happy about it, Liz.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very fair point, because no matter which way you lean in that argument, you're still getting a phenomenal game if it is at least based on what RE4 was, because that in itself is just a fantastic video game. There's no two ways about it. So yeah, I think that it could absolutely go in either direction. To me, almost the bigger question is, can a Resident Evil 4 remake actually live up to the original? And I ask that question not just because that was a great game and can a remake be quite as good, but Resident Evil 4 kind of changed third-person action games and certainly changed Resident Evil. And I just don't know if a game now could kind of have that impact. Particularly if Resident Evil 8, which is going to come out at least a year or two before it, presumably, is already making moves to have similar gameplay feel to that. I mean, I don't want to overstretch that. Like, we've seen very little so far, but there's just little nods to RE4 there. So if 8 is sort of a homage to 4, what does that RE4 remake become? What is that?
To be honest with you, can an RE4 remake, if it is doing something new, if it's trying to take what RE4 was as inspiration and do its own thing, can that be as hard-hitting as the original RE4? Almost certainly not, but that doesn't mean that it can't be a brilliant game, and that doesn't mean that it isn't worth doing. I almost admire the boldness to go in that direction rather than doing a beat-for-beat remake. Because as we were just saying, does RE4 strictly need a remake? Like, nah, not really. You could happily play that game and it holds up pretty well to this day. You can play it on PlayStation. I know a lot of people originally ran into it on GameCube, but I first played it on PlayStation. Even now, you know what I mean? And it would play pretty bloody well. So if you've already got a version of RE4 that plays pretty bloody well basically anywhere you would want to play it, then if you do a beat for beat remake, what are you really gaining there? Whereas if you try and do something more creative with RE4 and take RE4 and not even like a drastically different direction, but just take it in a slightly different direction from what we might be expecting, then I think that could be really interesting. But anyway, Lewis, I think we will have to call it a day there. I'd like to remind everyone that you can find PlayersToo on all the social media. That's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, the lot. You can also find our written content over at PlayersToo.com. That's PLAYERSTOO.com. And if you could take 5 seconds to give us 5 stars over on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, that really, really helps us out. It does a huge amount for the exposure of the show. And while you're over there as well, if you could leave us a review, it just helps us out even more. I know I say this twice a week, every single week, but it does not become less important on a weekly basis. If you could take that 5 seconds to do that for us, it genuinely does mean a lot. I'd like to remind everyone that our play-along game for this month is Unfinished Swan. This by Giant Sparrow Games, and we'll be talking about it next week, and I am very, very, very excited about it. I honestly think that this game is a bit of a hidden gem.
Nice.
And I'm very excited for you to play it, Liz. It's not a long game at all. It's only a few hours. It only costs a few quid as well most of the time. If you're paying any more than that, you can probably wait, but you can get it super, super cheap. But really, no excuse not to play along with us, so you should all totally do that.
Yeah, nice one. Yeah, it's still the unstarted Swan for me at the moment, but I am just waiting for a moment where I can dip out of Hitman for a few hours and play it, which will probably just be kind of over this weekend. Really looking forward to it, though.
Putting that English degree to good use with that pun there, Liz. Good stuff, good stuff. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will see you next week.
Thanks.